If debt is the promise societies make to the future, then inflation is the price they quietly pay in the present. It rarely arrives with banners or declarations. It seeps, it erodes, it alters behavior long before it dominates headlines. To understand inflation is to understand one of the oldest tensions in human organization, the desire to command resources today without confronting the full cost until tomorrow. Inflation is not a modern invention. It did not begin with central banks' paper money or fiat currencies. It began the moment authority discovered that controlling the medium of exchange could reshape reality itself. Long before coins clinked in purses, rulers manipulated value. In ancient Mesopotamia, price instability followed droughts, wars, and temple borrowing. Grain shortages drove prices upward, not because merchants were greedy, but because supply collapsed, while obligations remained fixed. Inflation in its earliest form was a symptom of imbalance between real resources and social promises. And societies learned quickly that when prices rose too fast, unrest followed. Hunger does not debate policy. The first deliberate inflations came with metal money. In ancient Lydia and Greece, coins were introduced as a miracle of standardization. Value became portable, divisible, countable. But rulers soon realized that coins could be altered. Silver content could be shaved. Alloy ratios could be changed. A coin could look the same while containing less metal. This was not counterfeiting, it was policy. The Roman Empire perfected this art. Facing rising military costs and stagnant tax bases, emperors repeatedly debased the denarius, stretching silver supplies to fund legions and bureaucracy. Prices rose, trust declined. Merchants demanded more coins for the same goods. Inflation became a silent tax on those least able to avoid it. By the 3rd century, Roman inflation spiraled into chaos. Prices multiplied. Barter returned. Soldiers demanded payment in kind. The empire responded with price controls, most famously Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, which failed spectacularly. History's verdict was clear, and enduring inflation caused by monetary manipulation cannot be cured by decree. Once trust in money erodes, authority weakens with it. The medieval world inherited these lessons imperfectly. With coinage fragmented and trade localized, inflation was episodic rather than systemic. But when it arrived, it carried familiar causes. Silver discoveries expanded money supply. Wars drained treasuries. Kings clipped coins. Prices adjusted. The moral language of the era often framed inflation as corruption or sin, yet its mechanics were unmistakably economic. Too much money chasing too few goods, though no one yet spoke in such terms. The great turning point came with the Age of Exploration. When Spanish galleons flooded Europe with silver from the New World in the 16th century, prices across the continent surged in what historians call the price revolution. Wages lagged, landowners prospered, debtors benefited, creditors suffered. Inflation reshaped social hierarchies not through violence, but through arithmetic. This was not debasement, it was abundance. And yet the effect was the same. Purchasing power declined. Inflation once again revealed itself not as a moral failure, but as a structural outcome of monetary expansion outpacing production. By the 18th and 19th centuries, paper money entered the stage, and with it, a new dimension of inflationary power. Paper promised flexibility. States could fund wars without waiting for metal. Credit could expand faster than mines. But paper also required trust, and trust proved fragile. Revolutionary France printed assignats to finance its upheaval. Prices exploded. Savings vanished. Social order frayed. The lesson echoed. Rome, money untethered from restraint, dissolves into instability. The 20th century transformed inflation from an episodic threat into a systemic policy concern. World War I shattered the gold standard. Governments printed to survive. Prices soared. Hyperinflation followed in defeated nations, most famously Weimar Germany, where money lost value so quickly it became absurd. Wages were paid twice a day. Savings evaporated. Social trauma embedded itself deeply into political memory. Inflation was no longer merely economic, it was existential. And yet, after the Great Depression, inflation's reputation shifted. Deflation had proven equally destructive. Falling prices crushed debtors, paralyzed investment, and deepened collapse. Post-war economists concluded that modest inflation was not a vice, but a lubricant, greasing economic adjustment, easing debt burdens, encouraging spending. Central banks were tasked with managing it, not eliminating it. Inflation became something to target, tolerate, and fine-tune. For decades, this balance appeared stable. Productivity rose. Trade expanded. Inflation stayed tame. But beneath the surface, the ancient forces remained. Governments borrowed. Central banks accommodated. Supply shocks emerged. The 1970s oil crises reminded the world that inflation could return violently when energy money and geopolitics collided. Prices surged, not because demand overheated, but because supply fractured. Inflation revealed its many faces: demand-driven cost, push monetary psychological. The late 20th century ushered in a long lull. Globalization suppressed prices. Technology increased efficiency. Central banks gained credibility. Inflation faded from public fear into academic debate. Some even worried it had disappeared forever. But history does not retire forces. It pauses them. The 21st century reawakened inflation's relevance in new forms. Massive monetary expansion after financial crises, pandemic disruptions, fiscal stimulus on wartime scales without wartime production. Supply chains strained. Energy shocks returned. Inflation reemerged, not as an anomaly, but as a reminder that prices rise when promises outrun capacity. Once again, societies debated, causes blamed actors, and searched for villains. But inflation, like debt, does not require malice, only imbalance. Across millennia, one truth persists. Inflation is never purely about money. It is about trust. Trust that money will hold value. Trust that production will keep pace with claims. Trust that institutions will restrain themselves when restraint is required. When that trust weakens, prices speak louder than policy. And so inflation has followed humanity like a shadow, sometimes faint, sometimes monstrous, reflecting how societies choose to resolve the eternal tension between scarcity and desire. It has toppled empires, quietly redistributed wealth invisibly, and rewritten social contracts without ever asking permission. And as the modern world once again confronts rising prices, the question is not whether inflation is temporary or permanent, but whether societies understand what inflation has always been, trying to tell them a question that can only be answered by looking beyond headlines and models to the deeper historical rhythm that governs money power and human behavior, a rhythm that reveals inflation not as an accident, but as a consequence, one that will continue to reappear whenever promises exceed reality, a consequence that grows louder the longer it is ignored, and whose final expression will only become clear as the modern era moves further into a world shaped by debt demographics and decisions that cannot be postponed forever. Decisions that will determine whether inflation remains a manageable signal or becomes once again a destabilizing force capable of reshaping societies just as it has done many times before. A force whose full implications will unfold not in theory but in lived experience, shaping politics, investment behavior, and the quiet choices people make every day when they sense that money is losing its memory. For inflation's ultimate power does not lie in charts or indices, but in how it rewires incentives and corrodes trust over time. When prices rise persistently, societies begin to change their behavior in subtle but profound ways. Savers stop saving. Cash becomes something to escape rather than hold. Long-term planning shrinks as horizons shorten. Why defer consumption if tomorrow's money will buy less? Why trust contracts if their real value is uncertain? Inflation quietly tilts society toward immediacy speculation and defensive behavior. It rewards those closest to the source of money creation and punishes those furthest from it. This is why inflation has always been political, even when framed as technical. History shows that governments rarely confront inflation directly at first. They explain it away. They call it temporary, transitory, exceptional. Roman emperors blamed merchants. Medieval kings blamed hoarders. Modern politicians blame corporations. Supply chains, foreign wars. These explanations are not always false, but they are rarely complete. Inflation persists when authorities choose accommodation over restraint, because restraint is painful and accommodation is popular. Inflation is easier than taxation. It is quieter than default. It is the least visible way to reconcile promises with limited capacity. Eventually, however, inflation forces a response. And those responses tend to fall into a few recurring patterns. One is monetary discipline, tightening credit-raising rates, accepting recession as the cost of restoring trust. This path is socially painful, but historically effective as seen under Volcker in the early 1980s. Another is financial repression, capping rates, directing credit-eroding debt through controlled inflation while restricting alternatives. This path preserves stability at the expense of savers and often persists quietly for decades. A third is denial and collapse, where inflation accelerates into crisis, destroying currencies and regimes alike. Which path a society chooses reveals its political character more than its economic theory. For investors, inflation has always been a sorting mechanism. It punishes fixed claims and rewards flexibility. Those holding cash or long-term nominal bonds suffer. Those owning real assets, land, commodities, productive enterprises fare better. This is why inflationary eras reshape wealth distribution. It is also why inflation fears often drive speculative manias. When money feels unstable, people rush into anything that feels scarce. Gold, real estate, art equities, cryptocurrencies, history cycles through them all. Inflation does not create bubbles by itself, but it provides fertile soil for them. The modern era adds a new complexity credibility. Central banks today operate not only through rates and balance sheets, but through expectations. Inflation is as much psychological as it is mechanical. If people believe prices will rise, they act in ways that make them rise. Wages adjust. Contracts change. Businesses preemptively increase prices. Inflation feeds itself. Breaking that cycle requires not just policy, but belief that authorities will endure short-term pain to prevent long-term decay. When credibility falters, inflation accelerates faster than models predict. This is why inflation often follows periods of extraordinary intervention. Wars, crises, pandemics, moments when survival justifies suspension of restraint. In those moments, inflation feels secondary, almost trivial. Only later does it assert itself, demanding payment. Inflation is the echo of emergency. It arrives after the danger is past, when societies want normalcy, but must first settle accounts. Across history, the societies that managed inflation best were not those that denied it, but those that respected its message. Inflation is not random. It is feedback. It tells us when claims on resources exceed what the economy can deliver without distortion. It tells us when money has become a substitute for productivity. It tells us when trust is being asked to stretch too far. The danger of the modern world is not that inflation exists, but that its lessons are forgotten between episodes. Long periods of price stability breed complacency. Models replace memory. Each generation believes it has tamed inflation for good, only to rediscover that control is conditional. Inflation is never abolished. It is merely dormant. When I look across centuries of price upheavals, from debased Roman coins to Weimar banknotes to modern stimulus-driven surges, I see a consistent pattern. Inflation reshapes societies before it reshapes policy. It changes how people vote, how they invest, how they measure success and security. It widens social fractures quietly, long before they become visible in protests or populism. And once embedded, it is far harder to remove than to ignore. The final lesson of inflation through the ages is therefore one of restraint and memory. Inflation is not evil, nor is it always avoidable, but it is always consequential. It demands honesty about trade-offs. It punishes the pretense that prosperity can be printed. And it rewards societies willing to align promises with productivity, ambition, with capacity. As the modern world navigates an era of aging populations, heavy debt burdens, geopolitical fragmentation, and technological disruption, inflation will remain a companion, sometimes distant, sometimes uncomfortably close. The question is not whether prices will rise again. They always do. The question is whether societies will recognize inflation early enough to respond deliberately, or whether they will once again learn its lessons the hard way. If this journey through the long history of inflation sharpened how you see prices, money, or power, share what stayed with you. And if you want to keep exploring how financial forces quietly shape civilizations, follow the channel and stay with this unfolding story, because inflation, like history itself, never truly ends. It only waits for us to forget why it matters.